A lot of people say capitalism is broken, that it creates inequality and that we need a better system. In this video, I want to take a step back and look at capitalism for what it really is. Not as an ideology, but as a system that naturally emerges when people trade, create, and build. I want to explain to you why some of the downsides of capitalism aren't actually caused by capitalism itself, but rather by humans, and also why the system is probably better than you thought. So, let's dive in. If you put a group of people on a deserted island with nothing but their skills and the resources around them, what would happen? Some would start fishing, others would gather fruit, and maybe one of them would figure out how to build a shelter. And eventually they'd begin trading with each other. A person that catches a lot of fish might trade with someone that gathered fruit, and so on. No one forced them into the system, it just happens because it makes life easier for everyone involved. Capitalism is always talked about as if it were a system that someone sat down and designed, just like a board game with rules that the rich made to exploit the poor. But that's not what capitalism is. It's not a political ideology, nor is it a policy enforced by governments. Capitalism is simply what happens when people are free to trade, create, and exchange value. It's the natural result of human interaction in a world of scarce resources and infinite wants. And here's one of the key characteristics. Those people that provide more value to others receive more in return. If one fisherman finds a way to catch twice as many fish as the others, he has more to trade, meaning he can exchange his fish for better tools, better shelter, or even hire someone to help him expand his operation. This is the core of free trade. If you create something that benefits others, you get rewarded in the form of resources in proportion to the value you provided. The more value you provide to society, in this example in the form of fish, the more you can exchange for the resources, the services, or the comforts you want. So the system isn't based on charity or luck, it's based on incentives that drive innovation and prosperity. So that's capitalism at its core. People specializing in what they're good at, trading with each other, and increasing the overall prosperity in the process. The alternative would be a world where no one is allowed to trade freely, where individual value is not rewarded, and where a central authority decides who gets what. One of the most common arguments against capitalism is, why do we even need money? Why can't we just make everything free? Sounds like a dream, right? Free healthcare, free housing, free food, no one struggling, no one left behind. But here's the problem. Nothing is ever truly free. Everything requires resources, whether it's human labor, raw materials, or time. If you just remove the price tag, those resources won't magically appear out of thin air. Someone, somewhere, still has to produce them. And if there's no incentive to do so, production slows down or stops entirely. And this is where basic supply and demand comes in. When things are free, people tend to overuse them because there's no cost keeping them in check. A classic example I think of right now is our own food consumption in all-inclusive resorts. So imagine if every grocery store suddenly gave away all the food for free. What would happen? People would take more than they need, store shelves would empty in hours, and farmers wouldn't have the incentive anymore to produce more food because they're not getting paid anymore. So the results would be shortages, rationing, and eventually a black market where people do pay for the goods under the table just to have basic necessities. So let's now look at two real-world examples where governments tried to make essential goods and services free for everyone. The USSR promised a society where wealth was shared and everyone had access to the same resources. The government controlled nearly all production, set prices, and ensured that goods were distributed fairly. But what actually happened? Well, since there was no competition or profit incentives, factories had no reason to improve efficiency, innovate, or even produce quality goods. The state dictated production targets, so how many units to produce of which item, which often resulted in absurd outcomes like warehouses full of unusable steel, while basic consumer goods like shoes or bread were scarce. People would stand in line for hours just to get basic necessities, and the economy stagnated, corruption flourished, and eventually the system collapsed under its own inefficiency. A more recent example is Venezuela, a country with one of the largest oil reserves in the world. For a time, the profits Venezuela made from oil funded massive social programs, allowing the government to heavily subsidize food, housing, and other essentials. But when oil prices dropped, the entire system unraveled. Instead of adapting, the government kept spending like before. They tried to keep things free by printing more and more money. But printing more money without also creating goods and services just makes things more expensive. This is called inflation. With time, the government didn't just control prices, they also took over businesses and industries like farming, grocery stores, and oil production. But without competition, there was no motivation to make things better. So everything just became inefficient and eventually collapsed. Because prices were set too low, farmers stopped farming, truckers stopped trucking, and factories stopped producing. Food, toilet paper, medicine, everything disappeared from store shelves and people fled the country just to survive. So what's the lesson here? When you detach price from value, things break down. Prices exist for a reason. They signal demand, they guide supply, and reward those who provide valuable goods and services. When a government removes prices and incentives, shortages, inefficiency, and economic collapse inevitably follow. So why do all these examples of failed economic policies matter? Because they all ignore one fundamental principle: supply and demand. This is the single most important force that makes an economy work, and yet so many people fail to understand it. If I had to explain it to a 5-year-old child, this is how I do it. Imagine you have a lemonade stand. On a hot summer day, lots of people want lemonade, but you only have a few cups. Since people are willing to pay more for it, since it's hot outside, you can raise the price. But if it's a cold, rainy day and no one wants lemonade, you have to lower the price to get people to buy it. That's supply and demand in action. So supply is how much of something exists or can be made, demand is how much people want it, and price is exactly the balancing point between the two. Now let's apply this to the real economy. Let's say there's a huge demand for housing, but very few apartments available. What happens? Rent prices go up. If the government now comes and says, that's unfair, let's make rent prices cheap again, that's what rent control is. Landlords stop building new apartments or take less care of them because it's no longer as profitable. So over time, you end up with even fewer and worse places to live in, making the problem even worse. Or take the example of labor. If a job requires a rare skill, like a software engineer or a brain surgeon, for example, only few people can do it, so brain surgeons get paid a lot. This creates an incentive for more people to go to medical school, balancing the supply. But if the government just sets job wages arbitrarily without considering the demand, businesses may stop hiring or move elsewhere, hurting the economy. If anyone could do brain surgery, their salary would drop. That's why people go to medical school for years to learn a valuable skill that's high in demand. Now, why is supply and demand so important for a free society? Because when prices are set naturally by the market instead of being controlled by the government, it encourages people to provide value. If a business makes a product people love, they make money. Take Apple, for example. Apple doesn't force you to buy an iPhone, you buy it because it makes your life easier. No one gets rich in business without providing value. If they stop, they go bankrupt. Simple as that. Investing your money is also a form of providing value. People think investing is just rich people making money off money, but actually investing is fueling economic growth. When you buy stocks, you're funding companies that provide products, jobs, and innovation. I, for example, work as a flight attendant, and without my airline's shareholders, me and my colleagues wouldn't have been able to buy the planes that we work on and take people to their destination. And when you invest in real estate, you're funding housing people need. So investing isn't hoarding wealth. It's literally putting money to work in a way that benefits society. If a worker learns a skill that companies need, they get a good salary. Even if you don't own a business or invest, you can create value by working. Jobs exist because businesses need value in form of some sort of service to support or expand their business model. The more value you bring, the more money you earn. A doctor, for example, earns more than a cashier because he provides a rarer and more essential service. This is also the reason why minimum wage cannot be indefinitely high. If a worker provides less value to the company than it costs the company to hold them, it doesn't make sense to hire the worker in the first place, resulting in unemployment. So you see, capitalism isn't a man-made system. It's just how people naturally interact. Even if you put a group of people on a deserted island, eventually they would start trading based on supply and demand. That's why every attempt to force an economy to work differently by ignoring supply and demand fails. The Soviet Union, Venezuela, and countless other cases show what happens when you try to manipulate an economy without respecting its basic principle. When people are allowed to freely exchange value, society grows, new innovations happen, and people get wealthier overall. That's the beauty of supply and demand. It's a simple rule that keeps everything running. Karl Marx is one of the most influential thinkers in history. His ideas inspired revolutions, shaped governments, and continue to influence political debates today. He believed that capitalism was an unfair system where the rich, the bourgeoisie, exploited the working class, the proletariat, and that eventually workers would rise up and replace capitalism with a classless, socialist society. It's a compelling story, one that still appeals to many people today. But what if I told you that reality played out differently? Instead of capitalism collapsing under its own weight, it's created more wealth and lifted more people out of poverty than any other system in history. So let's break down the key claims Marx made and see how they actually turned out. Marx argued that workers are stuck in low-wage jobs while business owners take all the profit. And he believed that the only way for workers to escape the cycle was to overthrow the whole system. But what actually happened was that instead of being trapped, workers in capitalist economies have more freedom, mobility, and opportunity than ever before. One of the biggest flaws in Marx's theory is the assumption that workers are powerless. In reality, a worker's power depends on supply and demand as well. If many people have the same skill set but only few jobs require it, wages stay low. But if the skill is rare and high in demand, like the software engineers or brain surgeons we talked about, workers have significant leverage over employers. So in reality, anyone can learn a new skill to increase their value in the job market, change careers, or open their own business. And today it's easier than ever. The internet has made it possible for anyone, anywhere to access free or affordable education, develop skills, and even work internationally through remote jobs. For example, a self-taught programmer in India can now work for a tech company in the US without ever leaving their country. That's something Marx could have never predicted. So what about corruption, monopolies, and crime? It's true that in some places, workers and business owners face barriers that limit their ability to succeed. Corruption, organized crime, and political instability can prevent fair competition and make it harder for people to move up. However, these problems are not caused by capitalism itself, they're caused by human nature. A corrupt government, a violent gang, or an oppressive dictator can exist under any economic system. In fact, socialist regimes have often been among the most corrupt and oppressive. As for monopolies, those are the exception, not the rule. In most cases, competition forces companies to innovate and improve. Even big and very big companies have to compete, or eventually they will decline. Take Nokia, MySpace, and Blockbuster for example. And also, businesses need workers just as much as workers need the businesses. Companies can't function without employees, which is why they compete for the best talent, leading to higher wages, better benefits, and improved working conditions. Again, depending on the area you're educated in, you can have way more power than your employer when it comes to negotiating. Think software engineers or even contractors or builders are needed so much at the moment. But if you're educated in an area where it's hard to stand out because there are already too many other people applying for the same job as you, it'll be hard to negotiate. Marx believed that industries and businesses should be controlled by the government instead of private owners. His idea was that if the governments ran businesses, they would prioritize the needs of the workers and the society instead of profits. On paper, this sounds fair, but in practice, it fails every time. What actually happens is that when the government runs businesses, the lack of competition, accountability, and incentives leads to inefficiency, waste, and ultimately worse outcomes for the very people it was supposed to help. One of the best modern examples is the housing market and rent control. Some governments try to protect tenants by imposing rent control, which are laws that limit how much landlords can charge for rent. The idea is simple: make housing affordable. But here's what really happens. With price limits, landlords lose the incentive to maintain properties. Why would they invest their money in renovations and repairs if they can't charge higher rent to cover the costs? As a result, many rent-controlled apartments slowly deteriorate. Net housing developments slow down. If developers can't expect to make a profit, they simply stop building. This leads to fewer available apartments, creating housing shortages. Ironically, rent control often makes housing even more expensive. As supply shrinks, people get desperate and landlords find loopholes like converting apartments into luxury condos or renting illegally at higher prices. When businesses compete in a free market, they constantly have to improve, whether it's lowering prices, improving services, or creating better products. When governments run businesses, however, there's no competition and no personal stake in success. Look at transportation in some cities. In places where the government has a monopoly on public transport, like Germany for example, you see outdated infrastructure, poor service, and financial losses. Since the people running it don't lose money personally if it fails, there's little urgency to improve efficiency. Venezuela once had one of the strongest economies in South America, thanks to its oil industry. When the government took over the oil companies, they stopped reinvesting in maintenance and innovation. So instead of operating efficiently, they became corrupt and bloated. When oil prices dropped, the industry collapsed because state-run companies weren't prepared to adapt, unlike private companies in other countries that managed to recover. The results were economic meltdown, hyperinflation, and mass poverty in Venezuela. So when you take away competition and incentives, businesses stop improving, innovation slows down, and quality drops. Marx simply underestimated how powerful personal investment and accountability are in keeping a system running efficiently. One of the biggest criticisms of capitalism is that it creates inequality. Some people say there shouldn't be billionaires if others struggle to afford basic necessities. On the surface, that sounds like a fair argument, but let's take a closer look. The important question is not inequality. It's poverty. The mistake many people make is focusing on inequality itself rather than absolute poverty. If one person has $10 and someone else has $1,000, there's inequality. But as long as the person with $10 has everything they need to live comfortably, does it really matter that the other one has 1,000? It would only matter if the so-called zero-sum fallacy, which means there's one big pie and when someone gets more, the other one gets less, were true. But it's not. More on that in a video I'll be posting next week. What really matters is how well off the poorest members of the society are. And capitalism has done way more than any other system to lift people out of absolute poverty. Since the 1980s, global extreme poverty has fallen from 42% to less than 10%, despite the fact that billionaires exist and inequality has technically grown. The rich getting richer has not made the poor more poor. It has actually helped raise living standards for everyone. So here's why billionaires are not the problem. Many people think billionaires are bad for society, but the existence of billionaires is not what makes people poor. In fact, billionaires often create value and opportunities for millions of people through the following. Number one, business and job creation. Billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk build companies that employ millions of people and provide goods and services that improve people's lives. Without private ownership and wealth accumulation, there would be no Amazon, Tesla, or Apple. Investment and innovation. The ultra-wealthy invest in new technologies and industries that drive progress. If Steve Jobs hadn't built Apple, we might not have the smartphone revolution as we know it today. Philanthropy. Many billionaires give away vast portions of their wealth to fund research, education, and poverty reduction efforts. Bill Gates, for example, has donated billions to global health initiatives, helping to nearly eradicate diseases like polio. If you simply took all billionaire wealth and redistributed it equally, it will solve literally nothing long term. The money would be spent and there would be no sustained economic growth or innovation to replace it. So capitalism isn't the problem. It's the reason billions of people have escaped poverty, created wealth, and built better lives. It's not about making sure everyone has the same amount of money, it's about rewarding people for the value they provide to society, which in my opinion is a far better system. A business owner makes money by selling products people want. An investor funds assets that society needs. An employee earns by providing valuable services. None of this takes wealth away from others. Quite the opposite. It creates it. So instead of blaming capitalism, focus on providing value, because that's how you get ahead in an economic system. And if you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more real-world takes on money and economics. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.